Hello book lovers, and welcome to today's video, which is my October wrap-up for 2018. During the month of October, I read pretty much exclusively horror novels. I thought that would be a fun thing to do, give myself a theme, and I love horror. It's one of my favorite genres. There is one exception this month. I did read one fantasy novel because it came out this month. I had it pre-ordered. I was super excited to read it and I didn't want to wait. But other than that, let's dive right into my Spooktoberfest 2018 wrap-up. So I read 5 books this month. The first one is Dead Lake by Darcy Coates. This one was an interesting one. It was kind of a combination of something I'm used to seeing in the horror that I like to read, and a different subgenre entirely. I don't think it meshed very well, and the book did read as if it was one of her earlier works, which it was. It was from 2015, I believe. So she's obviously grown a lot over the years, and I love Darcy Coates. She's my favorite horror author, basically. She writes ghosts really well. The one thing I would like to say is that the setting was really interesting. It wasn't as well developed as a lot of her other ones, but basically the main character goes to her uncle's cabin for a week to try and keep herself from the distractions of the modern world so that she can finish doing some of her art that she hasn't done in a while because she's got a showing coming up. It's quite tropey, not necessarily in a good way in this particular case, but I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars because I enjoyed it. So next up is another Darcy Coates novel called Hunted, which is a similar principle. Aileen goes missing in the woods on the last day of her solo trip, and her brother Chris and her friends can't accept what the police are telling them about the situation, that she's gone, there's no hope in finding her remains. So they actually enter Ashlow Forest themselves to try and find her, hoping for the best. Obviously the best doesn't happen the way they'd like, and things just go horribly wrong for them, as they often do in this kind of survival horror subgenre. There's a lot of, is it a cryptid, is it a human, is it a ghost sort of thing, which I find interesting as well. I won't tell you which way it goes because that would be spoilers. But I ended up really enjoying this one a lot more because of the atmosphere. It was very claustrophobic, very foreboding, and I think Darcy Coates wrote that brilliantly, and that is actually one of her, if not her most recent novel. So it was good to read these two back to back because I really got to see her growth and her development as an author. And I gave that one a 4 out of 5 stars. So the next book I read, the third book I read, is the fantasy novel I mentioned. It was Soulbinder by Sebastian de Castell, the 4th novel in his Spellslinger fantasy series, and I absolutely loved this book. I love all the books in the series. I get really excited about it. I've been pre-ordering them. The next ones are coming out next year, the last 2 books in the series, and I can't wait. I won't go too much into a synopsis on this one, just in case you haven't read the previous books. I don't want to spoil you. But it is nice to see Kellen, the main character, standing on his own 2 feet a bit more, learning to take care of himself, learning to combine all of the tricks and all of the tools that he's gathered over the previous 3 books and find a way to move forward in his world and in his story. I loved all of that. There were some interesting new characters, some interesting returning characters, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5. Absolutely loved it. I would absolutely recommend the Spellslinger series. It's my favorite series at the moment. I'm just loving it so much, and I hope you guys do too. So the 4th book I read this month, we're hopping back into the horror now, in case you were wondering, was The Haunting of Hardstone Jail by Amy Cross. One thing that confused me a bit about this title is that pretty much every time they mention the jail within the narrative, it's called Hardstone Prison. So I'm not sure why she went with jail for the title. Maybe it was catchier. I prefer prison, but that's a personal thing. So in this one, women have been sent to the women's jail. which dates from the Victorian era, and it's clear that there is something there that is going to cause problems. I'm having a hard time describing it without, spoiling anything. But I started off with high hopes. I've never read a book set in a jail before, and it was a Victorian era jail, and I'm all about Victorian era stuff. And it was interesting to find out who I would classify as the main character's backstory. It was trickled in here and there. It wasn't one big chunk, and I really appreciated that. And then I sort of got to a point where I was starting to get exhausted reading it. I just wanted it to be done. Then we got to the ending and the big reveal, which was just a whole mesh of different horror tropes all smooshed together and not for the better. And it went too fast. So I went from being exhausted to going, wait, it's over? And it was just a very dizzying experience that I didn't enjoy. And that, coupled with the fact that it wasn't overly original, it did rely on a lot of tropes, and it didn't do them in a refreshing way, I ended up giving this one a 2 out of 5. And then the last book I actually just read, so my thoughts are still a bit of a jumble in my head, and it is Suicide Forest by Jeremy Bates. Obviously set in the Suicide Forest, a group of friends decide to climb Mount Fuji, but there's a weather warning and they can't, so they decide to camp out in Aokigahara Forest, also known as Suicide Forest. It's a real place in Japan where a lot of people go to commit suicide. It's sort of more known for that than anything else these days, though apparently it is actually very beautiful as well. So I was intrigued by the setting. I was a Japanese major at university, so I was intrigued by a Japanese setting. I have a morbid fascination with locations like the Suicide Forest, especially ones that are supposed to be haunted. So this book really felt like it was right up my alley. Then we get into the story, and it starts off a little bit slow, but it feels like an actual camping trip with friends. You get to sort of get to know the different characters, like or dislike particular characters, and I thought that was done really well. And then we do start to progress, and I was interested the entire time. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. We did get to the reveal, and as is often the case, I was a little disappointed by what was actually happening in the forest. I'm not going to say anything, I don't want to spoil anyone, but I was personally a little bit disappointed. It's not always written well. You need to maintain the tension that was amping up, and a lot of horror novels don't maintain that tension, I think. And then the ending, it felt very rushed again. Things just happened really quickly. Things wrapped up a little too neatly to be overly satisfying. So I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5. I still really enjoyed my experience with it, but by the end of it, it wasn't going to be a 5-star read. So those are the books I read for the month of October 2018. The best book that I read was Soulbinder by Sebastian de Castell, the fantasy novel, and I totally recommend reading that series, the Spellslinger series. And the book I liked least out of the ones I read was The Haunting of Hardstone Jail by Amy Cross. I was about to call it Hardstone Prison, if that tells you anything about the point I brought up earlier. Yeah, so thank you for joining me in this video, and I will see you in another video for my November TBR. Thanks for watching.